Greetings, mortals. Welcome back to another show. Today, I have Ian Ferguson with me, and we're going to be talking about the Molochians.
Yeah.
You have to say it that way, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Gotta make it extra creepy and dramatic, right? Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, Tobias. Yeah, I run a channel on YouTube called White Lotus of Light. I also have my whitelotusoflight.com. And while my primary thing I do in life is Jyotish or Vedic astrology, the astrology of ancient India. Jyotish, it means the science of light. I also, as part of sort of like my spiritual services I offer on White Lotus of Light, one of the things I do is, I teach people angelic magic. And so for the past about 2 years, I've been working very intensely with the angels, and it's just been ramping up. And during that period of time, I'd periodically be given messages from either the angels or other spirits, such as Lord Thoth or Ganesha or Shiva, other spirits that I have a real close link with. And they started describing to me that there is a very large rift that has existed since forever, basically, among the power elite between groups that the angels referred to as the Molochians and the Luciferians. There also is like a third major group, which is the people who are aligned with the Most High. The Most High is the being, the deity that rules the Golden Age, is what I've been told. The Golden Age of the Sat Yugas. And that being's name has been lost because we're simply at too low of a vibration to know it here in the Kali Yugas. And you see this myth in many places, but most notably the lost name of God that the Jews are seeking, and the lost word of the Master Mason in Masonic lore, with Hiram Abiff being killed by his 3 apprentices before he gave them the word, right? The Masonic like key word of creation. And so you also see this in other places around the world, this myth of there being a very benevolent deity whose name is lost. And I just want to make that distinction because, as I'm sure you're aware, Tobias, of course, like Yahweh and Jehovah is not the God of the angels. That is a usurper, war, storm god, conglomerate, Levantine deity. It's not this much higher deity. And so they started, and then of course there's a fourth group, the Great White Brotherhood, or what have you, a non-dual group that actually kind of puppet strings all 3 of those groups, really, to guide this evolution. Yeah,
Brian is a part of the Great White Brotherhood. He told me.
Well, I mean, there's people who make that claim, and it's possible. I'm very open to it. I'm just not. I'm not sure that the actual Great White Brotherhood is really something that has a particularly inclusive membership. I think it might just be the 7 immortal sages that are in Shambhala or Shangri-La or whatever, the Tibetan plateau. And then there's sort of subsidiaries of that, right? Like the Sarmung Brotherhood that Gurdjieff talked about, etc. And so, yes, they certainly have energetic tendrils, so to speak, that stretch all over the planet. And I actually think that's who runs things ultimately. But in a certain sense, it's not relevant to us down on the ground, because since they're puppet stringing all sides to guide humanity's evolution, and that interplay between opposites, of like what we would call evil and good, and this sort of third Luciferian kind of thing, like they move humanity through that based on the era in order to evolve us spiritually. But what I would like to focus on is the other 3 groups today, which is the Luciferians, Molokians, and we probably won't dwell too much on it, but people like myself, and I think you, who are more moving towards that, wanting to have that harmonious golden age of the Sat Yugas and return that. And so I'm going to actually, like, real quick, pull up a diagram that I think is extremely useful in sort of explaining like an overview of these different factions and how it works. And so, there are people like us, especially at the tippy top of these different groups, who very directly interacts with these deities and worship them. But I think that for the vast majority of people, the way they experience these energies or these deities is more a state of consciousness, really, than it being direct deity worship. And so this is a diagram I made talking about these three main factions, not the fourth one that's hidden in the Tibetan plateau someplace. But we got the Molochians, the Luciferians, and the Most High. And it's sort of like this is the lowest ebb of consciousness of humanity, and this is the highest. This is the highest sphere. And I've been told by the angels, for what it's worth, and again, take it with a grain of salt. It's personal gnosis. It's not something that I can prove. But I have started to, in my opinion, tease this out in a way to where you can differentiate this group. But I've been told that Moloch, also known by the actual name of that deity of the people who worship it, is Hammon Baal, right? It's the deity that was worshipped in Tyre in particular, but also in Carthage. But the Jews...
Is that connected to Saturn?
Yes. Yeah, it's the lower aspect of Saturn. It's the lower aspect of Saturn. And it's the great enemy of the Jews during the era of King David, and it's actually the deity that brought about the downfall of King Solomon when he married a Tyrian woman from Tyre as part of Hiram Abiff, again, coming over and building, helping him giving him the plans for the great temple, right? The Temple of Solomon, the first temple. And he married a woman from Tyre as part of that attempted alliance with them. And she was brought with her a ton of astrologers and magicians, according to the Torah/Bible, and influenced Solomon, who was already very much into magic and was kind of trying this dual hand path of working to a certain degree with both angels and demons, which is interesting because around the time of King Solomon, you're at the absolute nadir of consciousness. You've gone all the way down from the descending Kali Yuga, and you're just about to go up to the ascending Kali Yuga. So Solomon actually is right at that point, that lowest ebb of consciousness of the Kali Yugas. And I'm guessing that most people on your channel are fairly familiar with that. You have a descending Kali Yuga, an ascending Kali Yuga, an ascending Dwarpa or Bronze Age Yuga, a ascending Treta or Silver Age Yuga, and then an ascending Sat Yuga Golden Age, a descending Sat Yuga Golden Age, and a descending Treta or Silver Age, a descending Bronze Age, and then finally you get back into Kali Yuga. And the cycle repeats. And what the angels have told me that I haven't really heard before, although it's very possibly out there somewhere, is that Moloch, right? Which is just a term I like because it has that nasty sound. It sounds more impressive to me. It sounds more impressive to me than Hammon Baal, which is their name for this deity. It has a lot more of a charge to it, which I think is important when you're talking about this deity. And, a lot of people talk about Satan and Satanism, and it's like, okay, well, Satan just means the adversary. And who was the adversary of the Jews? It was Moloch, period. And we need to start calling it what it is. Some people call it the Afro-Levantine serpent dragon, the lower aspect of the Gnostic demiurge, right? But I believe that the demiurge changes the way it works depending on what yuga you're in. And so right now we're in the Molokian era, which is just about coming to an end here in 2025. And so you will see that our history of the past 6,000 years, which is interestingly all the history we have, and just so happens to coincide almost exactly with the Kali Yugas, right? You see things like this hive mind mentality. We're seeing a lot of it right now with, the people we like to call NPCs, who are just like, the TV said to do X, Y, and Z. That's what it is, right? There's that hive mind mentality. There's no individuation. There's a real push towards dead materialism. Why dead materialism? Well, because if you just think that you only live once and then it's a black screen, you're going to be very fearful around your body. And you're also going to almost certainly slip into nihilistic hedonism, because why not, right? And then it becomes about what I can get away with rather than what has some kind of higher meaning to the individual. And so this one really pisses off the atheists, but in my opinion, atheists have been duped into a very dangerous mindset that leads inevitably towards things like the Great Reset and other things, because you're going to act out of fear most of the time. I have met some courageous atheists once in a while, who often atheists are very ethical, but it's easier to corral them, in my opinion, through fear because they're afraid of dying. It's also easier to pull them into nihilistic hedonism because, again, they think YOLO, you only live once, right? So you also see slavery. This is key, the Epstein-style harm of children, right? Physical torture, might makes right, right? No contracts, no law. If I have the bigger gun, I'm just going to take it, right? There's no any kind of like, let's have a contract, let's whatever. I heard the Russians were describing NATO, which is very controlled by the Molokian faction, as not agreement capable, right? And that is a way of describing this Molokian energy, is they just believe might makes right, and that's it. And that comes again, dead materialism leads directly to might makes right. I mean, dead materialism is just, in my opinion, perhaps the most pernicious ideology that's ever been on the face of the earth. Sorry, atheists, but that's where I'm at on that one. So I doubt there's a lot of atheists watching, not library. So probably everybody's laughing about their atheist friends who are very often in the hive mind, right? And actually, they're being pushed into a literal hive mind in the form of these brain chips and the metaverse and all that kind of stuff, right? So you also see a lot of chaotic duality, right? Like it's something's black or it's white, it's evil or it's good. You see this kind of nonsense thinking with no nuance that's very primitive, that we see a bit in the fall of consciousness in the story of Eden, right? Which I believe is about the final fall into the Kali Yuga, right? Where we drop to the lowest level of consciousness. What was the crime that got them kicked out of the garden? They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They ate from a tree that made them see things as black or white, good or bad, and so you also see parasitism, right? Like, for example, fiat currencies are very parasitic. They're not adding any value. They're just extracting. They very much have an idea of a zero-sum game, and that they don't believe that the universe is fecund and creative. They believe that in order for me to gain more power and wealth, I have to take it from you or somebody else, right? Because there's just a finite amount. So they also want material stagnation for humanity. And you can see this in two very Molokian style moves historically, the way that the Vatican and the Venetian black nobility went out of their way to keep humanity down on the material level. And they tried to repress technological innovation. They tried to repress any kind of thing that would make the situation better than throwing your poop in the streets in the morning, like was happening in Europe in the Dark Ages, right? Which is when like Moloch was in full swing in Europe. Likewise, in the East, you can see the Chinese emperor, whenever someone would come up with a great idea, he'd have them come in. He'd say, hey, are you the only one who knows about this repeating crossbow that you made in 300 BC? And the guy would be like, yeah, just me. And he'd be like, oh, that's too bad for you, and kill him and take it and throw it in that room. Same thing with the water clock. So when the communists went into the Forbidden City, they found this big room off the side of the throne room that had all these incredible inventions, some of which were like from the BC era, from like 200 or 300 BC. They invented a repeating crossbow in, I believe, 200 BC in China. Just think about that for a minute. The crossbow, when it came to Europe, also was attempted to be banned by the Pope. Again, material stagnation. I just can't imagine what would have happened to warfare if a repeating crossbow had been released into the world in 200 BC. It would have been, that's pretty close to maybe not a machine gun, but at least a semi-automatic rifle at that point, right? You get 3 or 4 shots, like that would have been insane. I can only imagine. And the Chinese emperor was smart in the sense of he didn't want any destabilization, because the Molokians, their main kind of core belief is Moloch says, total submission and the fear that passes understanding, of fear so powerful that you would give your children to be harmed and, ritualistically sexually harmed and then sacrificed, right? Which takes a level of fear that's beyond imagination, that you give up your own offspring, which is kind of the most core trait of a mammal, is to not do that, or else none of us would exist. If that had really taken off, then, we would have all died out a long time ago, because there wouldn't be any more children. So the fact that we're able to overcome that most basic instinct of protecting a child is like a really next level fear, right? That these guys were doing and pushing. But as you can see, there's crossover between these groups. And now I'm going to talk a bit about the Luciferians. So the Molokians are quite dull, actually. They're very powerful, and to them, everything looks like a nail because all they have is this giant sledgehammer. They're not very creative. But you might say, well, wait a minute, the Great Reset, that's really creative. There's a lot of like brilliant planning in it. It's true. It's because Lucifer and the Luciferians are under the thumb of the Molokians during the Kali Yugas. It's just natural law to have all these inversions, all this negativity, to just have the Molokians are just, they're entitled to and will reign, and nothing can stop it. No clever planning, no beautiful, Yeshua coming along and sharing, beautiful, uplifting things for humanity. Nothing can break through it until the Kali Yuga is over. And then automatically the Molokians will end up falling. That doesn't mean be complacent, by the way. It just means, let that hope swell in your breast that we're about to end this era. That doesn't mean the next few years aren't going to be really crazy. They're going to be very crazy. Basically, any day now, you're going to start seeing, and I mean, in certain parts of the world, it's already happening. But very soon, like even in the more advanced nations around the world, there's going to be a very real, tangible, like chaos breaking out as we're in this phase shift moving into the new Yuga. So the Luciferians are actually in some ways, they're very different from the Molokians, and in some ways, they're very similar. For example, they believe very much in hierarchy, competition, conquest, desire for power. They're very ruthless. And that's why a lot of people who are, not well versed in esoterica and the occult mistake the Luciferian group for the Molokian group because they seem similar in some of the traits. And that's what confuses people, I believe, and also just a general ignorance of thinking that Lucifer and Satan are the same when it's crystal clear they're absolutely not. These same people think Baphomet is Satan. Baphomet is not Satan. It's God of alchemy. It's a merger of opposites. It's sort of a 0-point deity that's sort of the Switzerland of deities in a lot of ways. It's at the center point, and it's a god of alchemy. And so very often, both the Molokians and the Luciferians will appeal to Baphomet in order to bring about transmutation, because Baphomet's neutral. Baphomet will work for the Molokians. Baphomet will work for the Luciferians. Baphomet will work for the Most High. Baphomet don't care. Baphomet's there to transmute, and that's it. And so, that kind of ignorance leads people to thinking, if you're not in my church, you're the devil, and when people discovered that the world is, and this is, in my opinion, a fact, when the people discovered that the world is ruled by these black magicians, it's very tempting when you come to that horrifying realization. You see Sam Smith at the Grammys, you see all these Super Bowl halftime shows that are in your face satanic, Molokian, better put, right? It's very easy for you to then regress or retreat into like what's familiar to you that fights that being. And for most people, that's some Abrahamic faith if you live in the West, right? It's Judaism, it's Christianity, it's Islam. And so a lot of people retrench in that. And not only do they retrench in that, they don't go to like some kind of watered down version of those Abrahamic faiths. They very often go into the deepest, most supremacist, most reactionary, and orthodox isn't the right word, but like strict, there's a word I'm looking for, dogmatic, there it is, most dogmatic forms of these Abrahamic faiths. And almost always those Abrahamic faiths that are supremacists and dogmatic say, if you don't go to my church or my synagogue, then you are the enemy, right? That is actually Molokianism through the back door. It's that hive mind and chaotic duality, and they don't even realize it, but they're being run by fear. And when you're run by fear, Moloch's got you. When you're run by your intellect, right, you move more into this Luciferian sphere. And, when I say the Luciferian sphere, I mean, don't be alarmed if you see that you have a lot of these traits in yourself or you value these things. That's just natural because we're moving into a Luciferian age, because Lucifer rules the Bronze and Silver Ages. And then the Most High, whose name has been lost, rules the Golden Ages. And so Lucifer's about to take over in this Luciferian energy. And so they believe in things like enlightened self-interest, rule of law over man, meritocracy, honor contracts. That's where they are different from the Molokians. And actually also they're different from the Most High in that way. The Most High doesn't believe in enlightened self-interest or people who are in that. They automatically know that all is one, all is God, and therefore there's perfect trust. And if there's perfect trust, there's going to be automatic cooperation, and there's no need for enlightened self-interest. You're now enlightened in the interest of everyone, because not in some sort of communist dystopian hive mind way, but you're aware that everyone is individuated, but also part of this greater whole. Everyone is a beautiful facet on the gem of reality, right? So I myself tend to kind of hover in this end of things. And I sometimes spike up when I'm particularly happy. I sometimes spike up into, these levels. But sometimes if someone cuts me off on the freeway, I'm like, well, F you. Now it's competition, baby. And I'm going to conquer you, and I'm mad, and sometimes, if I get in my ego, I might have a sense of hierarchy or a sense of self-superiority, and so I might pop down into this lower aspect of the Luciferian sort of vibration or mentality, kind of however you want to describe it. And so then you'll see here in the higher end of the Luciferian sphere, you see cooperation. That's something it shares with the Most High. Advancements in the arts and sciences, both are totally into that. But again, that's in opposition here to the material stagnation and repressing of any kind of disruptive technologies that might threaten their rule. You see things like liberty and free will is super important to both the Luciferians and the Most High if they're operating at the higher levels. Some Luciferians struggled to reach up to these levels, but other people are up there. And improved material well-being of humanity. Also spiritualization of humanity. You'll notice that's in opposition to this dead materialism that the Molokians push. And so, for example, you have noticed probably since the internet came out, a very Luciferian invention, that there's been a real movement of spiritualization of humanity, and a lot of hidden esoteric and occult spiritual principles are now mainstream when only a very select few knew about it, even in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? But pre-internet. And if you go back before the 1960s, which had a big Luciferian burst to it, even though it was a Molokian gambit, the Luciferians took advantage of it, meaning the CIA acid waves, and some of the stuff that came out that was a gambit by the Molokians. The Luciferians took advantage of that to push out the spiritualization of humanity. So they also pushed through things like a lot of the Eastern teachings coming to the West. But in the West, in particular, prior to the 1960s and the acid waves and the hippie movement, there was really only a very select elite few who understood a lot of the esoteric and spiritual principles you talk about in your channel or mine, or I talk about in mine, that are now kind of common knowledge among people who are in this vein, things like chakras and auras and that sort of thing. And you can see how chakras and auras and that sort of thing, it's the devil, according to people who have retrenched into those Abrahamic faiths. They don't like it one bit, because actually a lot of the Abrahamic faiths and almost all power structures on Earth have been infiltrated and hijacked by the Molokians over time. So the Luciferians will work with the Molokians, and they kind of have no choice. And in order to be near those levers of power, which the Luciferians want power, that's something they share with the Molokians, they have no choice but to cozy up next to the Molokians and work with them hand in glove to some degree. And that's why you see things like the Great Reset. Like the Great Reset is a Molokian plan that the Luciferians built all the technology and planning for it, but the groundwork they've laid for that is dual pronged. One, it's putting out this idea of the Great Reset and eat the bugs and all that nightmare stuff, right? And it's a kind of almost a cartoon caricature of a bad guy. Look at Klaus Schwab. I mean, my God,
He looks like a Bond villain.
What's that?
He looks like a Bond villain.
He does look like a Bond villain, exactly. And also, like, they couldn't have found someone with a slightly less Nazi-sounding accent. Oh, yeah, the will to power. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, like, no offense to any German listeners or viewers, I love y'all, but like it is kind of like even you should have a little laugh there at how ridiculous that figure is, and yet he's being pushed forward. And the reason for that is because as this Kali Yuga comes to the end, the Molokians could no longer hide in the shadows, which is what they preferred, and scapegoat all these other religions and belief systems for their actions, right? It was the pagans in Europe. You know, like when people think about Satan, they actually have an image of the Celtic god Cernunnos with the horns and the lower half of the body is cloven hooves, right? And that god is actually, I'm not trying to defend that god, but that's very much a god of like the Celtic people who, were living in a state of where it was a mix of hunter-gatherer and like sedentary, like farming and so forth. And so they were still very close to nature, and Cernunnos is like, red in tooth and claw like nature, and is about how mankind is sort of coming out of nature, but still, especially below the waist, man is dominated by that animal nature, which is interesting both from the terms of chakras, right? The survival chakra and the sex chakra are both in that area, but also is interesting from a symbolic point of view. And so they would do things like, they would have a sacrifice, nothing like the Molokians who do it for very malevolent reasons, but they would like maybe have a yearly sacrifice of a person or two in order to ensure the harvest, which is not, I'm not into that. I'm just saying that's, again, an example of how a broad brush was painted by the Molokians. It's the Jews, it's the Muslims during the Crusades, it's the pagans, it's the Native Americans, oh, the Indians, they're the Hindus, that's the real evil, right? They've managed to, because they hide in the shadows and control those Abrahamic faiths, they had managed for a long time to get people to mistakenly think all these different groups were responsible for their actions. And
we have a saying for, do you know Wallenberg? Have you heard of Wallenberg?
No.
They're connected with Rothschilds. ABB. They own the company Ericsson. You know that, all right? Ericsson. You never heard of Ericsson?
No, is that like a Scandinavian company?
Yes, a Scandinavian company.
Yeah.
They operate without being seen is their motto.
That's
real Molokians. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, these Molokians have very successfully scapegoated dozens of other religions and peoples and ethnicities and cultures for their actions. And a big example of this is they started using, they're Tyrian, they're from Tyre, and before that, Babylon, and even back to Acadia, because the Tyrian language, we know linguistically is related to the Akkadian language. And so I feel pretty confident in saying that this goes back to Babylon and Acadia, these kind of bloodlines and the people who are behind the Molokian sort of power structure. But they consolidated in Tyre, and then they had a colony in Carthage, and these people are also known as the Canaanites or the Phoenicians, right? And this isn't to say that all Canaanites or all Phoenicians are evil and there's no value to any of the cultural contributions. I don't believe that. I'm just saying that within that culture arose this Molokian movement. And in Tyre, you could see it very well. And you also see how they transfer over like the Babylonian money magic and the talismanic properties of that. And so when Alexander the Great crushes them in 322 BC in one of the greatest sieges ever, and arguably the greatest siege that we have in recorded history, the Tyrians got smashed, and they were like, oh, and some of them fled to Carthage, which then got crushed in the Punic Wars by the Romans. And basically then the nobles of both of those groups who worshipped Hammon Baal, aka Moloch, or Kronos, or right, Saturn, right, the lower aspect of Saturn, those families then moved to Rome, and they would become the senatorial families, and they became fantastically wealthy during the Roman, even Republic, but especially the Roman Empire, which was very Molokian in nature, right? Literally crucifying people. Although it did have a bit, the Molokians, sometimes can't help themselves, and they want to take advantage of some of the technologies that the Luciferians bring forward to them. And so they get duped sometimes by the Luciferians will convince them that, hey, this will help you have more power and greater control, but it slowly but surely starts to break things open for humanity. So then these same families moved to Venice, and they created the banks of the Rialto, and they proceeded to bankrupt Proto-Europe forever during the Dark Ages. And then there was a conflict between some of the Italian noble families, and sometimes I'm sloppy in my language and will call the more Luciferian Italian noble families. I sometimes call them, have called them in the past, the Venetian black nobility, but really the Venetian black nobility is very close to exclusively Molokian. I think there's some among them that are Luciferian, but that's certainly the dominant current. And so for a while, the angels had told me all this stuff, that the Molokians ruled things, and I kind of had to reverse engineer and figure out, well, who are they referring to? And it's the Venetian black nobility. And then I was like, well, can I really call these people Molokian? Like, is there any proof? Do I have any proof that survived the destruction of, Carthage and Tyre? Sure, there's Saturn worship in Rome, but can I really prove that? And the answer is yes, I can now. I couldn't for a long time until I found this book, The Game of Saturn, Decoding the Solabusca Tarocchi by Peter Mark Adams. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a little passage from it, because this is the smoking gun. This is a smoking gun that proves to me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that almost 2,000 years after the fall of Tyre, they were still worshiping Moloch, the Venetians. So, The Game of Saturn is the first full-length scholarly study of the enigmatic Renaissance masterwork known as the Solabusca Tarot. It reveals the existence of a pagan liturgical and ritual tradition active amongst members of the Renaissance elite and encoded within the deck. By the way, quick pause. The Renaissance and Cosimo Medici and the release of the Hermetica is very much a Luciferian impulse, and you see that Luciferian impulse again in the Enlightenment, and then in the founding of the United States. Things like the internet coming out, that's that Luciferian impulse coming up. And the Molokians always try and hammer it down, right? Like, you have the American Revolution, then you have the War of 1812, the British burned down Washington, D.C., and then suddenly we have the first Bank of the United States, right? And the Rothschilds, by the way, are just little errand boys. They're junior varsity, like maybe even freshman team, compared to the Venetian black nobility, are way above the Rothschilds, and they bankrolled the Rothschilds. That's how the Rothschilds appear out of nowhere in 1776, and 100 years later basically own Europe. They didn't own Europe. Their bosses owned Europe. But we'll get into that more. So beneath its beautifully decorated surface, its imagery ranges from the obscure to the grotesque. We encounter scenes of homoeroticism. That's interesting because at that point in time, homosexuality was the death penalty in Italy. And so whoever made this deck to have such clear homoerotic images felt utterly safe and secure and basically above the papacy, in terms of they knew they wouldn't be able to be touched. So homoeroticism, wounding, immolation, and decapitation, redolent of hidden meanings, violent transformations, and obscure rites. For the first time in over 500 years, the clues embedded within the cards reveal a dark Gnostic grimoire, replete with pagan theurgical and astral magical rites. It's incredible. This book's amazing. Careful analysis demonstrates that the presiding deity of this cult object is none other than the Gnostic demiurge in its most archaic and violent form. Not sure I entirely agree with that, other than I think the demiurge changes in form depending on the era, right? Because like during the Kali Yuga, the demiurge's form of illusion, or Maya's form of illusion, is very dark and heavy and Molokian, and then the demiurge shifts as we move into the Silver and Bronze Ages, and it's much more like technological, intelligentsia, perfection of humankind, all this Luciferian energy, and that's what keeps people stuck in it. And then the Golden Age is like this harmonious age, and so I don't believe that. I just want to make clear that I don't think the Gnostic demiurge. That's the one part of this I don't 100% agree with. But he goes, it's none other than the Gnostic demiurge in its most archaic and violent form, the Afro-Levantine serpent dragon Baal Hamon, also known as Kronos and Saturn, though more notoriously as the biblical Moloch. Conveyed from Constantinople to Italy in the dying years of the Byzantine Empire, the pagan Platonist George Gemistos Platon sought to ensure the survival of the living essence of Neoplatonic theurgy by transplanting it to the elite families of the Italian Renaissance. I believe that this guy was more or less, whether he knew it or not, Luciferian, and he was bringing over these really powerful spiritual technologies with him, and he just gave it to the wrong people, or the wrong people got their hands on it. Within that violent and sorcerous milieu, Plethon's vision of a theurgically enlightened elite mutated into its dark shadow, a Saturnian brotherhood operating within a cosmology of predation, I would even say parasitism, which sought to channel the draconian current to preserve elite wealth, power, and control. This development marks the birth of an illumined elite over 3 centuries before Weishaupt's Illuminati. The deck captures the essence of this magical tradition and constitutes a Western terma whose talismanic properties may serve to establish an initiatory link with the current. So this tarot deck was used in initiatory practices to bring people into the current of Moloch. So if you have Moloch worship that exists almost 2,000 years after the fall of Tyre, I feel confident in saying it continues. I also feel confident in saying that it wasn't just a one-off family that did this. No one family would do this by themselves and have this kind of deck, which is a smoking gun, that they're not Christian and that they're going to get killed by the inquisitors. You know, they would never take that risk unless there was a power base that they could rely on. In other words, the oligarchs of the Venetians, who very much trace their history back to Tyre. And if you couldn't be in the upper echelon, the golden families or whatever, you couldn't be in the upper echelon in Venice unless you could trace your history back to Tyre. You know, you couldn't get on the council of 10 and all that stuff unless you like had somehow enriched the oligarchs to like an absurd degree through your brilliance. They wouldn't let you up in there unless you had that bloodline that went back to Tyre. So I feel very confident in saying at this point, because of this book, and props to Peter Mark Adams, that they worship Moloch, you know, and that's for me is the evidence from the direct gnosis that the angels gave me. And so they're saying that the Molochians and Luciferians, it's finally coming to a head. Lucifer doesn't like kissing Moloch's ring, but had no choice, right? At the deity level. And, you know, as above, so below. The Luciferians acted as the consigliere and administrative layer for the Molochians. And what I mean by that is there's also this Khazarian mafia layer, right? That's why a lot of people get stuck when they're trying to figure out who rules the world. A lot of people get stuck in, it's the Jews. No. You know, first of all, that's a vanishingly small minority within, you know, the Jewish tradition, and most of them are actually Sabbatian Frankists, which is just a pseudo-Jewish version of Molochianism. If you really boil it down, child harm, drinking adrenochrome, right? That's where blood libel comes from. It's these Sabbatian Frankists. It's not Jewish people. It's a specific subset of people who are about as Jewish as the oh god, what are they called? The Westboro Baptist Church is representative of Christianity. Like, come on, guys. Like, those guys aren't Christian and these people aren't Jewish. And in fact, I wish I could find this, but years ago I was listening to this hardcore Zionist in Israel, and he was saying that the biggest threat to Israel was the Sabbatian Frankist infection at the top of the power pyramid there, talking about the Rothschilds and stuff like that. And he was really pounding the table on, we as Jews need to root out this rot and get rid of these Sabbatian Frankist scumbags. So they're not Jewish in any sense of the word, neither bloodline-wise, right, Khazarian, nor are they Jewish in the sense of that they actually follow the teachings of the Torah in any kind of way. Like, at best, they take the worst aspects of the Babylonian Talmud and, you know, then they invert everything in the Torah. I mean, that's what the Sabbatian Frankist religion is. And they, you know, they're just not representative. And so at one point, there was a fight between, an internecine struggle between the families that were controlling the papacy at the time and the Venetians, and they wanted to pull more power into the Vatican. And so they did this by making it the death penalty to lend it interest if you were a Christian lending to other Christians. Likewise, these Venetian families pretended to be Christian, but they're not Christian. They're Molochians, right? So it's the same thing with the Jewish people, like, and just people need to get over that. And we can go into that layer a little bit more and how I think there's like an egregore to trick people who are looking into blaming the Jews. And so they said, well, oh, we can't lend at interest anymore. Well, there's all these people coming over from Khazaria right now because the Russians just crushed Khazaria not long ago, and now they've created the Pale of the Settlement. And we're starting to have waves of these Khazarian Jews are coming in. We're going to use them as frontmen, and that's where all over Europe, all of a sudden, boop, 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 pop up the court Jews, and that's where that period of history begins, where a lot of anti-Semitic a-holes will say, oh, what people's been kicked out of 130 countries or whatever the number is, right? And they're not wrong, but the question they should be asking themselves is, okay, if that's true, and that did historically happen, how is it that all those people get rounded up, executed, and their assets taken, and yet, boop, they pop right back up with a bankroll big enough to bankrupt a king? Well, they can't. That's impossible. There's not a chance on earth that would happen. But if the Venetians are using them as frontmen, it makes perfect sense. And around a few hundred years later, the Venetian black nobility, they come up with that name for themselves as kind of a flex on everyone about how insanely dark and evil they were and not to resist them. And so then in the early 1500s, the Pope at the time worked together with the French king, and I want to say the Germans, but I can't remember the third major player. And they joined together to form the League of Cambrai, and it's called the War of the League of Cambrai. And they had this huge army that was marching on Venice to just wipe it out, just wipe them out and take all their assets. We're done with these jerks, right? And they got within a couple days' march, and then the Venetians were pulling the right strings, the right bribes, the right assassinations, which they're so good at. And they got the Pope to kind of back off. And at the same time, like the French king had like a rival trying to take over while he was out of France, or maybe it was like the Spanish attacked him. I can't remember. Some other European country attacked him. So the French king had to go back, and the alliance fell apart. Well, a few different things then occurred to the Venetians. One, we better get a lot deeper in the shadows than we already are, because we almost got wiped out. Two, we maybe need to figure out how to have some kind of military branch to what we're doing, because, we had all this financial power. We had all this narrative control. I mean, they're among the first to do propaganda with the printing press. They immediately saw the potential of the printing press as a tool of manipulation. The Council of 10 in Venice is kind of the prototype of all later intelligence agencies. I mean, there's been some refinements and some additions based on technology or whatever, but really the Council on 10 came up with almost every single strategy employed by major intelligence agencies. And so they decided, man, even though we have the intelligence, even though we have the narrative control, and even though we have the financial control, we almost got wiped out militarily. That's a problem. And they wanted to hide. And the third thing is 1492, right? Columbus announces to the world something that was already known among a lot of the elites, including the Venetians, who had been using it as a secret store of gold and silver, or a secret way to get more gold and silver in that helped them manipulate gold and silver currencies throughout the continent. They knew about the New World. And they knew about the New World because of the Fourth Crusade, where they went in and they sacked the library there in Byzantium. I believe was it Constantinople? It must have been Constantinople at that point. They went in and sacked that library, and there's a lot of evidence that they knew about the New World. And then you have the Zeno brothers and Henry Sinclair going over to the New World in the 1300s, a full 150 years before Columbus. And eventually that got released from the Venetian archives, that the Venetians beat Columbus by like 150 years to the New World. The Templar beat all of them by even earlier, by decades earlier, because when they got suppressed, the Templar went over to the New World. And there's endless evidence on that, and I hand that over to experts like Timothy Hogan, right? So the Venetians knew about it. I think a lot of the nobles in Europe knew about it. So when Columbus, a Genoan, and Genoa was one of the big rivals of Venice, went and worked with the Portuguese and told them about this, the Venetians realized that the trading networks of the world would no longer be around the Mediterranean and the old Silk Road, right, which went through Khazaria, by the way, but rather it would be centered on the Atlantic, right? And so because of all these things I'm mentioning, we need to hide, we need a military, and we need to take advantage of the New World. And if you look at a map of Italy, Venice is in the extreme northeast in the Adriatic Sea. Genoa is on the western side of the Italian peninsula. So Genoa, their great rivals in Italy, had like a week or two advantage on ships moving, and that just it's a cumulative additional effect. It just keeps getting bigger. They would just keep getting further and further and further above the Venetians in terms of going to the New World, because they would have that first mover status, and that's nothing compared to what the Portuguese and Spanish had, right? Because they'd have to go all the way around the boot, the Venetians, and then through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. And meanwhile, the Portuguese especially can just go boop, 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 right over to the New World. And so they realized all this stuff, and they liquidated all their assets. They liquidated all their assets and made it liquid. And then their nobility moved here, there, all over Europe, and married into like Saxe, Coburg, Gotha, and Germany, and so forth. But their resources moved to Amsterdam and to the city of London. And in fact, Francis Bacon, aka Shakespeare, you can see that he warns about this in a number of his writings, and it's hinted at heavily in The Merchant of Venice, which a lot of people don't understand what Shakespeare was pointing to, but he was speaking to an educated noble class with some of that hidden information in The Merchant of Venice. And just there's other things around that time of people who were in the elite among the English who were saying, hey, we got to worry about this Venetian influence that's coming into Britain. But then that's what causes the British Empire to just out of nowhere, this little island is suddenly like mega powerful. It's because they were bankrolled by the Venetians. And you'll see that first the Spanish and Portuguese have their crack at the New World, right? Because they had that first mover advantage. And so they had the Spanish and Portuguese had the world's reserve currency, but they had problems. They were stupid. They didn't manage things well. I think the Venetians also like helped tank the price of gold and some of the other things that caused the Spanish to fall. And then you see that the guilder becomes the world's reserve currency, right? Amsterdam. It's also the hub of slavery. A lot of people forget about that, but long before the British and Americans got really into slavery, the Dutch were already mastering it. And then you see the British Empire springs up, and from there, like they spread into the United States. And then you have that 3 microstates thing. You have the Vatican, you have Washington, D.C., and the city of London. And that's the triad of Molokian control. The spiritual center, right? Spiritual, I use that word loosely, Vatican. Financial center, the square mile city of London. Not London, the vast sprawling metropolis, but the square banking mile city of London. That's a microstate that is not under the rule of Britain. And in fact, if the Queen or King, if Charles III was to go right now into the square mile city of London, he would have to bow to the Lord Mayor of London to even be allowed into it. He can't go into it without basically kissing the ring of someone, which, think about that for a minute. That's a trillionaire family, the Saxe, Coburg, Gotha. And even they have to go, oh, please, you know, right? And there's talk of like Queen Elizabeth was telling Diana, hey, we never talk about how we go down and we kiss the ring of the Pallavicini family down in Italy. That's who controls Saxe, Coburg, Gotha, is the Pallavicini family down in Italy. So they, you know, those 3 cities are the spiritual center, Vatican, the economic center, city of London, and then the military center, Washington, D.C. And if you look at the way things have run the past 500 years, that becomes obvious once you drill down on it. So we're now coming to a moment where the Molokians and Luciferians are about to go head to head. And the thing is the Luciferians are next level brilliant. They think multidimensionally. They think, very creatively. The Molokians are not creative. They're kind of dull. They're somewhat easy to dupe, it seems. It's just that for the longest time, like, it was just natural law that they would rule. Well, that's coming to an end. And the Luciferians are laying the groundwork to take over. And you can see it in that they're going after the Achilles heels of the Molokians. The Achilles heels of the Molokians are the financial system, right? And the Luciferians are getting ready to replace it with not Nassar and Gassara, but a quantum financial system, as it's sometimes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that QFS. Yeah. It's like gold-backed crypto or something.
So the angels told me last summer, look for a high-level adoption of gold and silver-backed crypto. That's going to help bring about the fall of the Molokians. So Sberbank in Russia just recently started saying that they're working on the XLM network. And I'm going to get into some esoteric symbolism on that in a second. But on the XLM network, which is part of the Ripple network, it's sort of a subsidiary of it, they're having a gold-backed stablecoin and for cross-border payments. Putin, in response to, and Putin's as Luciferian as they come, some Luciferians real quick. So some Molokians are obvious, Klaus Schwab, right? Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Augustin Carson's the Bank of International Settlements guy, right? Those guys are very Molokian. And one of the way you can tell Molokians from Luciferians is Molokians have a feel of a monster stuffed into a suit, right? They just, they're very like low energy. It's very just disgusting. Like the suit's not really hiding who or what they are, or their little sweater, Bill Gates, right? Oh, I'm so friendly. Like how anyone can believe that guy is a good guy is just beyond me. Like you have to be so stupid. But, you know, they have this feeling of a monster stuffed in a suit, whereas the Luciferians have a feel of a genteel quality, very much like a sophisticated scholar and a gentleman, right? And some examples of Luciferians are Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Brad Garlinghouse, the CEO of Ripple. Another person that, again, this shows how, you know, they say war, you know, politics leads to strange bedfellows, but war leads to even weirder bedfellows. And so some of the people who will be our short-term allies, perhaps, in the struggle against the Molokians that threaten all of us are some people you might not expect. I mean, I know I didn't expect this. Another one is Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, the CEO. He's starting to push back on the ESG, right? And Musk, if you look, he started like going directly at the WEF, saying you're an unelected global government, you know, nobody wants it. He didn't go to Davos, he made fun of him. He did go to the World Government Summit in Dubai or wherever it was, and he there said, we need to actually, I know this isn't popular in this room, but we need to look at decentralized cooperative style of governance moving forward, not, you know, with individuality and like sovereignty and liberty, basically, not consolidation of power. It's not going to work. And he actually got scattered applause when he said that. And probably for every person applauding, there was probably 3 to 5 more who were too scared to clap because they know, you know, what Klaus Schwab and those guys want. And so they didn't want to clap. But Musk in particular has been shooting shots across the bow. Well, people say, well, but Elon Musk, he's evil. Like, look what he's doing with the brain chip. But is he? Where is that brain chip? He's been working on it a decade. And I noticed something very interesting. In December of 2022, suddenly Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, dyed in the wool Molokians, are suddenly racing to develop a brain chip. Nobody was challenging Musk to do it because the Molokians had given it to Musk for him to do that project. But they realized that Musk has been slow rolling it. He's been like that slave in the field who leans on the hoe and, oops, I broke the hoe. I need another hoe. Whoops, I broke the hoe again. I can't seem to get anything done. He was slow rolling it and they just figured it out. And so now they're in a panic and they're trying to develop it. Similarly, the central banks have been trying desperately to create their CDBCs, but the fact is they're idiots. They understand banking, but they don't know how to do high tech, and they just don't have the in-house team to develop it. And so they've had no choice, and they've become dependent on intellectual property that they can't actually see under the hood. They've been testing it, but they can't actually see how these cryptocurrencies work, and in particular Ripple. But they've had no choice now because of timelines that they're aware of. They've had no choice now. Their hope is to freeze humanity forever in a slave system. That's the Great Reset. And in fact, what the Molokians want to do in order to achieve the Great Reset, the plan, according to Jim Rickards, is called ICE 9, which is a reference to the guy who wrote, oh man, I'm blanking on the author's name. I believe it's either the Fahrenheit, whatever, 459 or whatever it is, where they burn the books, or I forget what that guy's. Anyways, it's one of those great novelists, sci-fi novelists from the 60s or 70s. Just totally blanking on the guy's name. It's kind of embarrassing. Anyways, doesn't matter. In it, the scientist invents this molecule called Ice-9. And if a single drop of it gets into the world's oceans, the entire oceans freeze. Anytime this molecule touches anything, everything freezes. And if you look, there's really this symbology or symbolism of they want to freeze humanity stuck in place. And the reason they want to do that is they know tick-tock that their time is almost up. Those of them that have any kind of sense whatsoever. Some of them are just drunk on power and insane, like Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab, and then their bosses like the Massimo family, who's completely insane. Some of these other Venetian black nobility, they're so separated from society, they don't understand what's going on the ground. Then there's and so that's like a third of them that are in that drunk on power and kind of like don't see what's coming. There's a middle layer that's more like an administrative layer where they're closer to the ground and they see that they've lost the narrative and they're starting to panic. And they're the ones pushing for, we need to do this Agenda 2030. We need to do this Great Reset right now. Originally, all this stuff, the Great Reset, Agenda 2030 and stuff, is supposed to be by 2050. They were going to very slowly do it. Something has caused them to panic, right? Something has caused them to panic. Something that worries them very much. Some people theorize it's like, Homo sapiens interstellar, like our space cousins are coming back. Some people say that's what's going to happen. The Anunnaki or whatever, whatever you want to call them, who are very similar to us, but like slightly different because they genetically engineered themselves into the primates, that whole Zechariah Sitchin thing, which that's not really gospel to me, but something like that is true. Like, even if he got the details wrong, something like that is true. Like, humans aren't, in my opinion, aren't entirely from this planet. We're some kind of mix of some other species with the primates, and that's why there's this extreme sudden leap, or it's one of the reasons. And so whatever it is, it's causing a panic. And so that administrative level who's still loyal to the Molokian energy, they're like, we got to do this right now. And the people at the top are like, that's great. I'm drunk on power. I'm ready to have total control. But then there's a layer that's, in that administrative, scientific kind of like, bureaucratic layer that understands what's going on, and they're ready to jump ship and join the Luciferians. They realize they're going to lose. They're hip to the fact that their power ends in 2025 and they want to jump ship to the winning team. And so the Molokian faction is starting to break up and it's starting to fight within itself. And the Luciferians are embedded all throughout these Molokian networks, and the Molokians rely on them for any kind of high-tech stuff. And so I'm of the belief that the Ripple network in particular is going to end up what's being used. There's tons of Bank of International Settlement documents pointing to this and so forth. And I would say, look up the No Emotion podcast or the Black Swan Capitalist podcast, because those guys go really deep on XRP and how interconnected with this whole system is. But what they said is that there's going to be 3 tiers of crypto regulation, right, coming out of the BS. So the third tier is it has, in their opinion, it's not good. It has no value. They don't want it in there, right? And they say just basically regulate it out of existence, or, it can't be held by the banks is the main thing, and it can't be invested in by the banks. That's the rule that the BIS is about to roll out. The second tier, which can be held by the bank, must be ISO 222 compliant, which is almost none of them. It's like XDC, XLM, XRP, let's see, what's your Algorand, and what's the other one? I can't remember. Maybe I hit them all. It's rumored that the Cardano one, which is like Ethereum, it's a smart contract operating system one. There's rumors that Cardano is also in there, and IOTA is also ISO 222 compliant. And who founded it? The Ripple guys. But then there's the tier 1 asset, right, of crypto, right? It's not considered a tier 1 on the balance sheets, although I think they're proposing that it might be, which tier 1 is like, I think sovereign debt and gold are the only tier 1 assets, something like that. I forget what the Bank of International Settlements defines as other tier 1 assets. And it might just be a tier 1 crypto asset. I'm not entirely clear on that. But those assets not only have to be ISO 222 compliant, but they say they have to be backed by a commodity. And they mention Ripple and they mention gold in this document repeatedly. And so it looks like Ripple's positioning itself to be the bridge currency. Now, the Molokians think that they can't do what Ripple does. They haven't been able to crack it. They tried for a while and they can't do it. So they're like, well, we're just going to have to use Ripple. And they're nervous about it, I think. I think they can kind of sense that there's a trap, but they also feel like we don't have time. We have to push forward. I think some of them sense there's a trap, you know, the ones that are in that wavering layer or the layer that's ready to join the winning team, right? But the people at the top, they're like, it's going to work. It always works. We never lose. We're undefeatable, right? Because during the Molokian era of the Kali Yugas, they can't be defeated. And so they're drunk on power and they don't really understand that they're about to have the table run on them. They're going to use XRP as a bridge currency. And then this is the plan. Then all the different central banks will have like the digital pound, the digital krona, the digital dollar, whatever it might be. And when you want to switch from the digital dollar to the digital pound, you'll use XRP as a bridge currency. You'll sell your digital dollars into XRP and then transfer over into the reddish pound. And it'll happen almost instantaneously, but it'll have to go through that process. The only way they can get out of the debt trap that they currently find themselves in is a revaluation of gold. I mean, that's certainly going to happen. That's beyond a shadow of a doubt at this point for me, or well, as certain as I can be about anything, 99.99, right? They're going to have to revalue gold. And why do they have to revalue gold? Well, they don't want to they don't want to do a debt jubilee. They don't want to get rid of the debts because then all the debt holders, which spoiler alert are mostly Molokians, would get utterly screwed. But if you revalue gold massively, say $50,000+ an ounce, right, in today's purchasing power, then all of a sudden an asset you already have on the sheet has all these unrealized gains. And that can then overwhelm the debt. That number can be higher than the debt. And then you don't have to get rid of the debt. And then you can cash in that debt and it still has value. And the debt holders are made whole rather than being screwed the way they would be in a jubilee. It'll act like a jubilee for people who have the appropriate assets, which are mostly very wealthy people, things like gold and very likely XRP and XOM and some of these other things. But for everyone else who doesn't have those kind of assets and real estate, real tangible assets, they'll get wiped out in the hyperinflation that will occur at the same time. Because in order to revalue gold to the degree that they must do to cover the quadrillions and derivatives and all this insane debt that is out there, some people even say it's hit quintillions, which is insane. It's at least in the tens of quadrillions with a Q, quadrillions, not trillions, quadrillions, the derivatives. And those are just the ones that we can trace. There's the over-the-counter derivatives, and nobody really knows how many of those there are, right? So we're at least talking quadrillions. And so in order to cover all this debt, in order to cover the entire money supply of the world, you're going to have to revalue gold to a staggering degree, probably 50, maybe 100, maybe 200 or 300 times its current price. So you might say, well, gold's really low. Well, in order to maintain the fiat system, ever since they delinked from gold with the dollar and went on to the petrodollar, they've been suppressing the price of gold. So that way people couldn't see how much that they were just printing fiat currency in order to manipulate everything and use it as a weapon to control the planet. But now that time is coming to an end, and you see Russia and China just massively stockpiling gold. You even see much smaller countries like Hungary and Poland and stuff are just like really juicing up their gold reserves. Almost all central banks.
It's huge that Russia has a gold-backed currency now. Who would expect that?
After the sanctions, you're right. Putin said that they're going to peg. Well, what they said was the price of gold per gram is a certain number of rubles, which is
500 rubles, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact amount. That might be right, but it's they basically have a loose gold standard sort of now for the ruble. And what's going to happen is it looks like they're saying either 1 or 2 grams of gold is a barrel of oil. So that actually has been the case basically since oil became a commodity, actually. the price of oil and gold has been incredibly stable for a long period of time. It's just that there's been a lot of manipulation around the gold and oil markets in order to achieve that. So they're going to have to revalue gold. And like you say, Putin, again, very Luciferian, has already begun that process. And Sberbank is tokenizing gold, meaning that they're going to have a digital token that represents a physical asset. And then what they'll do is they'll have these big clearinghouses in various parts of the world that have a giant warehouse stacked full of gold. And then if you want to redeem it, you can do it. And then they'll very rarely move the gold once it's positioned into various different places. They probably won't move the physical gold very often. Maybe at first they will, because everyone has to have trust restored after this economic collapse that's coming. But the desire is to be able to move gold without moving gold, right? Because if you just have gold sitting there, it has no counter. If you have it sitting in your vault, it has no counterparty risk other than it's in a vault and you have a bunch of armed guys guarding it. That's your counterparty risk, is come and take it, bro. You know what I mean? But very little counterparty risk, whereas everything else under the sun has counterparty risk. Oh, dollar doesn't have counterparty risk. The hell it doesn't. The Federal Reserve's your counterparty risk, and they're inflating the shit out of it. Pardon. Sorry about that. You can just bleep that out. But there's counterparty risk for basically almost any single asset class, even real estate, right? Because the government can just eminent domain and take it, and they force you to pay property tax. So gold is basically, and silver are basically the only assets that have no counterparty risk. And that's why we had a gold standard for forever and ever. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's a big part of it. And so they want to have that no counterparty risk revaluation of gold, but moving the gold is a big pain in the butt. I mean, you or me, like throwing a gold coin back or forth, no big deal. If you have $100 billion oil deal, that's a lot of gold. And you want it, and now you have to have a bunch of armed guys go with a military escort and fly a giant plane with a fighter wing escort and fly it over, or put it on a boat, and there's a lot of risk there when you do that. And so if they can have tokenization of gold in a crypto asset that's in a trustless system and all the positives of crypto, then they can move it around. We'll see. What's going to happen, though, is, in my opinion, is the minute they flip the switch on that, you now have XRP backed in gold. XOM, it seems, will likely be backed in silver, and it'll be decentralized. It's a decentralized network. So you will suddenly have a bimetallic gold and silver standard that's global in nature through these currencies that anyone can participate in, and that'll just break the back of the Molokian fiat debt system in one stroke. But the Molokians think that they'll be able to set up their CDBCs and, make it so you have to spend your money and all this kind of evil stuff they want to do with the CDBCs that's just horrifying, and that they'll be able to have total control, but they'll have to have this XRP thing at the center. But what's actually going to happen is savvy Luciferian players will finally have this huge fetter or shackle that's been around their neck in the form of fiat currencies controlled by the Molokian central banks will be removed. And now they can engage in business without that intermediary and counterparty risk of those central banks. And it will just completely obliterate the central bank's control network. So that's one of the Achilles heels that the Luciferians are attacking. The other one they're attacking is the Epstein stuff. You notice how it just doesn't go away? No matter how hard the media tries to make it go away, it just don't go away, baby. In fact, they released Ghislaine Maxwell's client list not too long ago. The courts did, which was a very bizarre, shocking turn of events that doesn't make a lot of sense if, people want to keep that under wraps, which the Molokians do. Because I'm actually going to segue here for a second. When I was training with a shaman who was from a Siberian shaman lineage out of, I think it's Kamchatka, extreme northeastern Siberia, that's on the Pacific Ocean. He was half Kamchatka shaman lineage, and then he was half Inuit, what some people call Eskimo. And It's funny, this guy was like 6'4", 6'5", and had a huge, big, long white beard. I mean, the guy looked like Gandalf straight up, like including it's crazy. But this shaman who was like the first time I was initiated way back in 2004, he told me that the number one thing white magicians, shamans, I don't like to use the word light worker, whatever, people on the side of good who are spiritual needed to do is we needed to wipe out pedophilia. Right? Well, that seems good, right? Like protect the children. No, it's much deeper than that. I'm going to paraphrase the story he told me way back in 2004. He said, several thousand years ago, and I will say at the dawn of Kali Yuga, there were black magicians that were very powerful, and they had worked with basically every form of demon they could come across. But as the consciousness of humanity was descending, the demons they were working with said, there is a greater power. And the people are like, there's a greater power than what we've worked with? What is it? And they're like, well, in order for you to even know of this being, you have to start doing the ritual abuse of children in the Epstein style, right? And so they did that, and that opened a portal to the lower astral, to the lowest of the lower astral, the pit. And then Moloch could reach through that and touch the world. And so he said that we have to wipe it out because that'll close those portals to, he didn't use the term Moloch, although maybe he did, but he said it was an ancient evil demonic god, basically was how he described it. He might have used the word Moloch and it just didn't stick in my brain at the time, I don't know, but he's talking about Moloch for sure. And he said that we have to get rid of it. And the Luciferians are aware of this, and they're getting ready to do, like when they do this takeover, they're going to wipe out, one of the things I've been told is that within 50 years from now, that any kind of large scale pedophilia will be gone. There might be some minor stuff of like handed down in various families and abuse within a family, but it'll be very harshly dealt with. And any kind of large scale Epstein level blackmail, child harm rings and child trafficking will be wiped out, because they don't want to allow those people to have access to the power of Moloch. And so they will wipe it out for that reason. Again, a self-interested reason. They seem to find it abhorrent as well. They're not quite as disgusted by it as people who are in the Most High, but the Luciferians, they find it to be very barbaric, right? It's not genteel, it's monstrous, it's odious. They don't like it. Plus, they recognize that it's a critical fulcrum of the power of the Molochians, and so they want to close those portals. So that's another Achilles heel. Go after the blackmail rings. It's funny because the same blackmail rings that have allowed them to dominate, especially the past 50 to 75 years in the West, right? Although it even goes back further to the Vatican, there's lots of records about that, right? Like during the era of Martin Luther, like a bunch of naked boys popped out of the cake for the Pope. Like, come on, right? So obviously, like, this isn't a new phenomenon and it's been in there, but I'm saying the sort of extensive blackmail networks that MI6 and the CIA and Mossad have set up, people like, Epstein and whatever, Ghislaine Maxwell's father was involved in. I can't remember his name. He was assassinated, very much involved in Mossad and CIA. But those people, those networks were very useful for controlling politicians. But those exact same networks are an Achilles heel for, if it's exposed, pretty much everyone hates that stuff with every fiber of their being. And it's pretty much a universal across all cultures that we hate it. It's pretty much considered in all cultures except for this Molokian culture to be the worst thing that there is. And so, if that's revealed and it keeps being slowly percolating up, that would be a great way for the Molokians to be taken down. So you have the financial, you have the blackmail, and then what's I'm blanking for a second, the third one. Oh, just the media, the way that the media and the control of the media is that the third one I use? I'm blanking on the third prong. But the point being is that, it's the C word. It's the C word that's been going on. Sorry, that's the third prong. The fact that they just tried to kill us all with the jabs, right? that is, and so just imagine now it's 2027. The Luciferians have turned the corner on the Molokians. And now they're having something akin to Nuremberg 2, right? Which Nuremberg 1, by the way, was a kangaroo court by the victors, and it won't be any different here, right? But it's going to be a very compelling argument. Hey, these guys have been enslaving you with banking. Hey, these guys have been harming children and blackmailing with it. Hey, these guys just tried to kill y'all. We think we should execute these guys, and aren't we the good guys for having rode in like white knights to come take over? You know, don't you owe us your loyalty? And people will be like, oh my God, thank you. Plus they're going to say, hey, here's anti-gravity, here's free energy, whatever, cold fusion or 0 point tech or however they're powering these vehicles that they have, right? They're going to roll that stuff out. They're going to give all these positives. And they're also going to say, look how evil these guys were. We have the divine mandate to rule, and people are going to roll with it. In my opinion, almost everyone will be like, oh, well, thank God the white knight rode in to save us. But it's not really a white knight. It's more like a gray knight, right? As they showed in that picture. And so that doesn't mean I'm not predicting that we're going to have a utopia by 2030, but I think that we're going to have the beginnings of something akin to Renaissance Florence, right? Arts and science exploding. Liberty, like the American Constitution, which is about the most Luciferian document that's ever been written, the Constitution Bill of Rights, right? Very much meritocratic, very much about the perfected human, very much about the individual having rights. They're not threatened by people trading amongst each other. They're not, see, that's one of the big differences. The Molokians are super threatened by anything that whiffs of a challenge to their power. They stamp it out right away. The Luciferians aren't nearly as worried about that because they believe they're the best of the best. And they are usually. They're usually the most competent people, the most skilled, the most intelligent, are almost always Luciferians. They believe very much in meritocracy and the perfected man. But the perfected man from a spiritual ego, right? Of I'm the man, right? I'm the best. I'm the best. Because the Molokians, their core principle actually is self-hatred. Because Moloch offers either totally giving over to me, which is going to lead to feelings of self-hatred, or total annihilation. And so there's this desire to annihilate, right? And ultimately, they really want to annihilate this feeling they have in themselves of being so disconnected from source and so low consciousness. I mean, it must be truly miserable to be one of these people. And so deep down, they kind of have self-hatred. And the Luciferians, their kind of core principle is narcissism, right? You know, pride is Lucifer's favorite sin, right? Because that is the original sin of Lucifer, is pride. He said, wait a minute, God, I don't like what you're saying that we angels that are these beautiful beings of light that are immortal and super powerful, that we should now bow to the humans? No, right? He somehow, despite the fact that angels normally do not have free will, he somehow had a dose of free will, ironically arguing against free will. He's since figured out that free will is kind of like one of his core traits, because he thinks he can seduce people via this, you know, increased material well-being, this narcissism and so forth, right? And then the Most High is true self-love, to where you love yourself so deeply and that you recognize that I am you and you are I, and everything around us is all one. And from that flows all kinds of positive things automatically. From self-hatred flows slavery, flows harming the innocent and the children. From narcissism flows a desire to go hit the gym real hard. I'm going to study real hard because I need to be the best, right? So the Luciferians believe very much in meritocracy and vigorous competition, ruthless competition. They very much believe in it, right? These are the like ruthless capitalists, right? But by their actions of being ruthless and self-interested, there's enlightened self-interest. They create a company, it creates value, the economy grows, and the material well-being of humanity goes upwards, right? But it is still like, an example I like to use, the difference in mentality is, say you have a homeless problem. Well, the Luciferians would be like, I don't care, let them freeze to death. But if you said to the Luciferian, well, you know, in Utah, which this happened in real life, in Utah, they took the homeless and they put them up in motels and they built homes for the homeless. And then they found that 75 or 80% of them were able to get jobs and quickly get off benefits and start paying some rent. And we found that the amount of prison or jail time that the homeless were going into went way down. The amount of hospital visits went way down. The amount of crime went way, way, way down. The amount of drug addiction went way, way, way down. And so when we did the cost benefit analysis, it's better for economically for society if we house the homeless. The Luciferians would go like, oh, well, let's do it. That just makes sense. The Molokians would say, under no circumstances will we ever help the poor. In fact, can we make them suffer more? Can we harvest their organs? Can we assault them? Can we torture them to death? Right? Do you see the difference in there? One's kind of like a callous, I don't give a shit social Darwinism. But if you appeal to them logically, they'll be like, okay, that makes sense. Let's do it. Kind of ruthless and slightly heartless. But the other one's like not just heartless, it's like sadistic. Like I need to crush down the human spirit. So it's easy if you're not looking closely to mistake those two for one another, but they are actually very different. And so
I think it's insane the red market in China. You know, they're harvesting organs with like political prisoners. That's
right.
So Molokian.
Exactly. And it seems to me that the CCP as a structure is primarily Molokian, although clearly based on their technological expertise, there's Luciferian elements within it. But you can see now that they are, in my opinion, an example of the Molokians starting to fight one another. I do actually think this rift between Davos and the CCP is accelerating and increasing, in part because the CCP is realizing that they've been used as a test lab and that they've been being used, and that actually the Davos set has no intention of putting them at the top the way the US was. And the Chinese have figured this out. And so that's created a fraction among the a fissure among the Molokians, and you're starting to see the Molokians in the east and the Molokians in the west are ready to fight each other, with the Luciferians urging them on, whether it's Russia or which is a Luciferian country as a whole, I would say at this point, just the power structure and the way it works, or whether it's Luciferians within the CCP who have helped them with things like the digital currencies and the surveillance state and all that stuff. And that gives a good example of some things I believe that we hate about the Great Reset, unfortunately, will probably continue. I think CDBCs might roll out and quickly fail, right? They'll try and do it, but I believe it'll quickly fail, right? It'll quickly collapse if they even manage to roll them out at all. It might just be when they turn on the XRP network that it's over, that there won't be CDBCs. People will end up trading using, XRP or more likely XOM because it'll be a lower price backed in silver, or Algorand or who knows what, like one of those currencies or a derivative thereof will end up being what people probably do exchanges with. I mean, that's one scenario. Another could be is that there'll be a period of competition, then the CDBCs will fail. But I do think certain things that we don't like will continue. I don't think we'll have a brain chip. That's very opposed to the Luciferian system. I don't think that there'll be a metaverse that you're forced into. There might be one that you can move in, right? That you can freely choose to participate in, but you won't be forced into a pod and eating bug paste and all that kind of crap with a brain chip. That's the Molokians that's going to fail. But surveillance state, that's probably here to stay. The Luciferians built that. They see the value, right? They like competitive edges. They don't fight fair. They don't fight fair, baby. They get down and dirty, and that's part of how they're going to beat the Molokians. I mean, if it was up to the Most High, right, we'd be turning the other cheek, and that wouldn't work so hot, right? Like the Molokians will win. If it was the Most High was going to take over, we might be like, we forgive you, pedos. The Luciferians will wipe them the F out, no doubt about it. So, a part of me that I guess has a slightly vengeful streak against that particular group, because I think it's so particular odious, is I'm rubbing my hands for when they start going after the pedos. That's for damn sure. I will cheer when that happens. I'll never worship Lucifer, by the way. If you do, hey, I believe in free will, do whatever feels right to you, but I never will. That said, I can recognize when you have an existential threat that's going to wipe you out and someone I can work with who's agreement capable. And I'm going to choose the people I can work with who are agreement capable. And honestly, like 21st century technology, Renaissance Florence with individual liberties sounds pretty damn good to me. You know what I mean? Compared to what we've been dealing with, like true free trade, all that kind of stuff. Or, they'll probably be, the Luciferians, they don't mind about lying. They don't fight fair, all that kind of stuff. So I think they'll keep the surveillance state basically for sure. I think that probably digital ID in some form is an inevitability. And I'm not naive. I understand the risks of CDBCs and digital identity. That is scary, and that is something to where we really need to talk about it. But the fact of the matter is, if you're in the United States and you want to buy a gun, you're going to have to show ID. If you want to buy some liquor, you're going to have to show ID. If you want to go do all manner of legal things, form a corporation, open a bank account, all this kind of stuff, you got to show an ID. In fact, about the only thing you don't have to show an ID in is voting. Kind of weird, kind of funny that people would push back on that you need to identify yourself for voting. That's racist. No, it's not. All those people have ID, bro. And if not, they can get it from social services. I know, because I used to be a social worker. So that's a trash argument that the Molokians push so they can rig elections, right? So point is you need an ID to do almost anything in society already. It's a physical ID. And look, the world's getting more and more digital. It just makes sense, right? I mean, CDBCs and so forth, but just for a second, imagine a reasonable digital ID, right? That would get rid of spam bots. That would get rid of just if I never had to do CAPTCHA ever again in my life, it would almost be worth it. You know what I mean? Not if it led to CDBC nightmare, digital gulag smart cities, but if it was used and I didn't have to verify my identity all the time and jump through a million hoops, just the convenience and the smoothness, and also just the responsibility, right? An ID creates responsibility. Anonymity does not. And part of the reason people are such egregious a-holes on the internet are in part because there's a lot of anonymity possible on the internet. Part of it's just that you're not right there, because I'll have guys who are in their 60s who, weigh 130 trying to talk smack that if they did that in real life, I'd be like, would you like to repeat that? And he'd our little fat guys who weigh 300 pounds in their mom's basement or whatever. And even if they might say it to me, they would never say it to these super buff guys I know, but they do online. And so part of that, some of that stuff comes from anonymity, the being super, super nasty. Like some of the most nasty stuff I've ever seen on the internet is almost always someone who has some degree of anonymity. So there could be some real positives to a digital ID. It doesn't have to be evil. Could it be evil? Yes. Driver's licenses in the US are evil in a certain sense, and some people say you don't have to have them, sovereign citizen, all that kind of stuff. And they can be used for bad purposes, but they're also used for very practical ones that actually I agree in order to have a complex society. You do kind of need to identify yourself. I mean, that's just where we're at in terms of the complexity of our society. And as things move more digital, of course, we're going to need to have a digital ID. Does that mean that we should just blindly go down the garden path and not worry about it, not talk about it, and just trust that it's going to work out? No, absolutely not. We should be making absolutely certain that as part of a digital ID is something akin to an ironclad Bill of Rights, perhaps something programmed in cryptographically to our IDs that forces that issue. I'm not sure exactly how that'd work. I'll leave that to the technical people to solve it. But there's ways that we can implement a digital ID that aren't necessarily bad. And so it's not like I don't see, I don't think that we're moving into utopia, but I will tell you, it will seem like a utopia compared to what humanity's been suffering the past 6,000 years. And really, things didn't start getting better for humanity until we started moving in the upward ascending Kali Yuga. And really, it didn't start getting really good until around the time that Cosimo Medici, who I believe we all owe a debt of gratitude to, who was certainly a Luciferian, might have even worshipped Lucifer, his translating of the Hermetica and releasing it, and him being one of the major patrons of the Renaissance, the Hermetica, I mean, I don't have to tell you the importance of it, and that those ideas coming out into society as a whole, just super powerful and important. And so, that Luciferian impulse is what has made humanity's situation better. The Luciferians don't like slavery. And, it was Luciferians who got rid of it, working with people from the Most High, sure, but like a huge amount of the things that we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for someone who was probably unconsciously within the Luciferian current, right? All this technology involved for us to do a Zoom call, digital cameras, the internet. You're in Sweden, right?
Yeah, northern Sweden.
Norway, and I was like, no, don't get it wrong. Because I know, to an American, Swedes, Norwegians, it's hot blonde chicks. We don't really know that, right? But I know that you guys care very much, and so I wanted to be respectful. And I'm glad I got it right. And so, I do think things are gonna get a lot better because of this movement. But in the next few years, we're in a phase shift, and anytime there's a phase shift anywhere in reality, there's going to be a lot of chaos. But the flip side of that is, we all need to work on surviving it and take basic standard things, get yourself food and water, all that kind of stuff, get yourself some gold and silver if you have excess money beyond, food and water and that kind of stuff. Maybe get out of major cities, especially if you're in the United States or mainland Europe. I'm not super worried about Sweden other than maybe some of your refugee problems that you guys have there. That could be a problem, but I think that would be dealt with swiftly if indeed things started to get chaotic, So I'm not worried for you. I think that you're in a pretty safe part of Europe as far as Europe goes. But if you're in America or any of the English-speaking countries, or if you're in mainland Europe and you're in a city, you might want to consider getting out of it. If you're in Eastern Europe and you have the means and ability to get out of it, I am concerned about Eastern Europe being swallowed up in a limited regional war. I don't think I'm certain there won't be a nuclear holocaust, for what it's worth. Angels told me that'll never happen. And it makes sense from a pragmatic point of view. Like, nobody wants to rule a cinder husk, and nobody really wants to be stuck in an underground bunker for the next, 20 generations. So they won't do that. They might use tactical nukes. That could happen. False flag. That could happen. And where that's most likely is major cities and that corridor to where historically whatever power dominates the great plains of Central Asia, right, which is Russia currently, used to be the Mongol horde. What always happens historically is the people within that basin, it eventually becomes a single empire, essentially. It just keeps happening. And then that empire always realizes that their one weak spot is to the west, and it's to this area of like Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, that whole entire band, right? That's the area that makes them very vulnerable. It's the soft underbelly of otherwise this like incredible inland empire. And so historically, if you look, Eastern Europe has had conflict galore, and even into, I would even be concerned, well, there is one area in Scandinavia I would be concerned in, is Finland, right? Because again, they're just kind of in that general band, Belarus, all that stuff, and so if you're hearing this and you have the means to move out of there, do so. If you can't, move rurally. Just prepare yourself that you may have to at some point, move somewhere, even if you don't feel like you have the means right now, you might be forced to. Just be aware there's some risk there. And so just do some stuff to take care of mitigating risk, but don't stop there. Don't just be focused on survival. That's fear-based. That's going to attract you the negativity you want. Think about how you can thrive. It's cliche, but there's the Chinese character for crisis is also opportunity. There's tremendous opportunity here to create generational wealth, to get on the ground floor of this coming civilization, that the Luciferians are going to provide, which I believe will be pretty amazing to live in. It's not going to be perfect at 2030, but it'll be starting, and things will have calmed down a lot, is what I've been told, for what it's worth, and take it with a grain of salt. That's what I've been told by the angels. And so that's a very lengthy diatribe, I know, but I just kind of wanted to get the thesis out there. And then would you like to poke holes in it or ask me questions or whatever at this point?
I'm terrified that Sweden and Finland is joining NATO.
Yeah, I would be too.
Yeah.
And I would fight against that if I was in a Sweden or Norway. Or is it Sweden and Finland? Sorry.
Sweden and Finland.
Yeah,
Norway's already a part of NATO.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So yeah, I mean, I understand why the Finns in particular would want it. Sweden, and it doesn't make any sense to me. It just endangers you. I also actually think it endangers Finland to do it. I think it's foolish and short-sighted. And I honestly I love the Scandinavian cultures. I think they're among the most beautiful on earth. You guys have like some of the purest Scythian bloodlines, and that general culture of strong competition and keep our people safe and maybe go off and loot some places for a while and come back. But there's a very beautiful culture of we take care of our own in Scandinavia that I very much admire. And I think in many ways Scandinavia kind of has the purest sort of doctrine, if you will, of the true pagan, true European roots. That doesn't have nearly as much of the Levantine influence of the Abrahamic faith. I think that there's still, even if people are atheist or agnostic or consider themselves Christian in Scandinavia, the principles there are still much more akin to ancient Europe. And so I have tremendous respect for the Scandinavian countries. And, I do hope that you guys navigate this difficult time to come. I think you will. I have a lot of faith in your people. So, yeah.
I think a big thing is going to be legalization of plant medicines, like psychedelics. That's going to be a huge revolution for mental health and just a general awakening of people.
I agree. And that's part of this, in my opinion, Luciferian / most high impulse of spiritualization of humanity, right? Because the part of what's going to do it is people are going to realize there's something bigger than themselves by taking those plant medicines. And so I see that as that Luciferian / most high impulse, because that's on the upper edge, where it's the crossover between the two. Both desire spiritualization. And so, yeah. Are you guys on the cusp of legalizing psychedelics? And
no.
You mean
it's going to be eventually. Sweden is going to be like the last country to legalize weed, I think, in Europe.
You guys don't have legal weed?
No.
Wow. Well, I guess we don't in the US either. We do in my state, but not in
the US.
Oh, it's considered illegal, weirdly. I think we're about half legal now in the States. Like half the states have legalized it. And they finally, if I remember correctly, Biden finally moved it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. So Schedule 1's like heroin and cocaine and meth, no medicinal. It's just pure illegal. It's the most illegal. I believe they reclassified it. So we're in the process here in the US. And we're also in the process of legalizing psychedelics. We have 2 states that have legalized psychedelics to some degree. My state, Oregon's off the hook, man. We straight up decriminalized personal use amounts of all drugs. Did you know that? Oregon Trail. I don't agree with that, because there's a big difference between psychedelics and weed and meth, or heroin. And if you look at Portland, it's the big city in Oregon, there's a massive drug problem, and so
and there's been opening up a lot of ketamine clinics. That's gonna be huge.
Has some value too, although that can be dangerous. My thought on psychedelics is that it's not like weed. We need to treat psychedelics, and I would put ketamine in this category. The only two drugs that I feel somewhat okay with that people can take, although one of them it is a little risky, is ecstasy and weed seem to be somewhat, they do have negative consequences, both of them. They're not perfect, but and in particular, you have to be careful not to fry your serotonin centers with Molly, but you don't really need a specific circumstance to take Molly and have it have positive impacts. There is risks of the addiction and the serotonin burnout, but I don't really feel like you need a special circumstance for it. Same thing as weed, right? mushrooms and LSD and ketamine and ayahuasca and toad venom, MEO,
Mescaline.
mescaline, all that stuff. If you don't have a good environment, it can lead to a psychotic break. If you have a lot of trauma that's unrealized and you're not ready to face your trauma and you take a bunch of psychedelics, guess what's going to be one of the first things that comes up, guys? What you need the most healing on, which is going to be trauma. And you might face that trauma in vivid and powerful form. It certainly happened to me when I was taking psychedelics back in the day, and I didn't understand that I had all this repressed trauma back then, So I just think that's one thing is I'm a big believer in the power and usefulness and utility of the psychedelics, but I really think they need to be looked at even really as sacred, like not just having a controlled clinical setting. I actually don't think that's taking it far enough. I think you really need to have someone who's holding the space spiritually for you and can kind of guide you through it, unless you're made of sterner stuff. Some people can take that heroic dose of 5 dried grams or whatever it is, and they can tough it out, and other people take it and they're never the same. Also with psychedelics, I would meet burnouts back in the day when I was in Eugene at the University of Oregon, where lots of people, there's a big psychedelic thing, you had the Oregon Country Fair and hippies and stuff around there and stuff who had settled down there. So there's lots of like acid and mushrooms and stuff down there. I would meet a lot of burnout guys who had taken way too much psychedelics. And one guy goes, "Yeah, man, I think I took too big of a bite from the tree of knowledge, bro." And burnout, and he didn't function right because he took too much. There is such a thing as too much. You have to be careful. And if you take too much all at once, that could be too much. There's also, they seem to me like psychedelics have a cumulative effect that takes a long time for that meter to sort of drop back down to where it's safe to start taking it again. And I myself, I took a lot of psychedelics when I was younger. If it's past the statute of limitations, it was whatever amount of years ago would put me beyond the statute of limitations. You'd have to be 15, Ian. Sure, that sounds good. Yeah, but I took a lot of psychedelics when I was younger, and I did start to get to a point in my late 20s where I realized I needed to stop because I was starting to get like kind of untethered from this world, and more of my consciousness was getting kind of stuck in the astral to a degree that was making it difficult for me to function well. And I would take a little tiny dose of mushrooms and it'd be like, and it shouldn't have been that strong, but it was, I think, because of the cumulative effect. And so I'm a big believer in plant medicine, but I think we need to look at these things as sacred. And I did, even to a large degree in my 20s, I did treat it very reverently usually. There was a couple of times when I was very young that I took it kind of recreationally, but I don't think recreational psychedelics is a good idea. It should be used for a healing and spiritual journey, and it should be used sparingly. Another thing that I think about with psychedelics is some people think that, I can just psychedelic my way through all my spiritual growth because I saw God and I had psychic abilities. I was telepathic when I took shrooms or whatever, right? And it's like, yeah, but then what happened when you came down? Oh, well, like none of my stuff wrote, what I mean? Like people can have huge breakthroughs with toad venom or whatever, and I'm not disputing that, but people will mistake that too. Well, I can just do all my work in psychedelics. I don't have to do anything when I'm sober. And I feel like psychedelics are kind of a cheat code or skipping ahead in chapters in the book, right?
Yeah.
But you need to go back and read the rest of the chapters, and that's you doing your shadow work and integration, and doing that deep work when you're sober, and not just relying on the psychedelics. I think psychedelics are amazing, especially for people who are like atheists or agnostic, that it can make them know that there is a God, that there's God consciousness and that there's other beings, there's other intelligences out there because you can interface with them quite easily in psychedelics. And so it's great for that. But I think that sometimes people, they want that pinnacle experience and they can get stuck in it, and they can get stuck in a rut and mistake that, I just need to sit with plant medicine. It's like, no, you've sat
Chasing the dragon.
Huh?
Chasing the dragon.
Exactly. Right. And so people either want to have that peak experience again, or they're not willing to actually implement what they learned during the trip in a practical way and integrate it within their life. They want to keep all those same negative habits, but then be able to talk to God because they ate a bunch of mushrooms, and again, it's about balance. It's about, and the best way to do that, in my opinion, is if you treat it as a sacred medicine and you understand its limitations. So, yeah.
So do you want to wrap this up? It's been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, sort of more like a TED Talk lecture.
No, it's been brilliant.
Just...
It's been great. I learned a lot.
Oh, that's
I hope my audience does too.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, the thing is like, and I get that I go off, and listeners probably annoyed as I was reaching a point and then I'd suddenly divert to a side thing. Just the way my mind works is I'm able to see big picture stuff almost effortlessly for some reason. It's just a gift that I was given for whatever reason. And it's not really it's not something that I did through my own effort. It's genetic, or it was a gift in my soul, whatever. So I'm not like saying it in an egotistical kind of way. I'm just saying that's how my mind operates. And so I see sort of like this vast tapestry, and it's like I feel like I'm supposed to talk in this talk about this little thread or this little section of the tapestry, and I'm like, but that won't make any sense unless you see the big thing. And I just kind of want to put it out there, and I'm trying to consolidate or condense decades of research in occult, esoterica, conspiracy theory, if you want to call that. I'd say conspiracy reality, right? And gnosis and stuff, and trying to condense and consolidate that into a cohesive picture that still isn't like, if I was wanting to really go into detail, I would probably need to write a series of books, and I would probably need to
you should
I've had people tell me that. Thank you. Maybe I will. Maybe on this exact subject. I think it's kind of sexy, and I think the time's kind of right for it. And so I would need so much time to be able to dump the information I have, because a lot of I understand that a lot of the claims I make, and I'm not talking about the what I describe as gnosis, but just things where I say X, Y, or Z historical thing, like in order to actually truly justify it meticulously with all the details, it would take so long. Like, the data's up there for me, but I just hope that the information I provide gives jumping off points for other people to do their own research, because you certainly shouldn't take what I say or what anyone says as just gospel. You should be using it to do your own research. And I do want to say, probably some of the stuff I said to you, viewer or listener, you were like, that's bullshit. I don't like that. That doesn't feel right for me. Throw it in the trash. Just take what resonates. I'm not saying I'm some kind of final arbiter on this stuff. This is what I think is a useful map of this power struggle and spiritual warfare that's going on. At least I hope it's useful. It's not perfect. It's something that I'm continuing to refine. And there's times when I find out that something I thought was true was incorrect. And I hope to have the humility when that comes along to correct that, but it's not perfect. And so if something doesn't resonate with you, or for a fact something I said is incorrect, I mean, I would love to hear why you think that, because probably I've heard the counter.
Leave it in the comments below.
Leave it in the comments below. But I'm telling you, if you come at me with, it's the Jews and you're a traitor, Goyim, you're a race traitor, I'm not going to bother. I'm not interested. If you start saying the earth is flat, I'm not going to bother. I'm not interested. I'm not going to engage with nonsense, or stuff that I've already disproven in my mind. If you can come up with some kind of like unassailable historical information or something that disproves something, I'm super open to that. It's just like, I'm pretty confident in a lot of my historical research at this point, because I've read a lot, and I've discerned what's true and what's not. But again, I don't feel like it's a flawless body of knowledge by any stretch of the imagination. So take what resonates, get rid of the rest.
Let the audience know where they can watch your stuff.
Yeah, so I have a channel on YouTube called White Lotus of Light, and I'm slowly but very slowly putting it on Bitchute and elsewhere. I'm way behind on that. I have a Telegram channel, but it's basically in stasis or coma right now. I haven't really done anything. I'm going to develop that more. And then whitelotusoflight.com is where you can find me. And, you know, one of the main thing I do is Jyotish, or Vedic astrology, the science of light. And the difference there's many differences between Jyotish and Western astrology, but one of the primary ones is where Western astrology is very much about exploring your spiritual, emotional, psychological nature, and really kind of isn't super deterministic, and it's more like free will oriented. Vedic astrology is about reading your karmas. And so in these challenging times, it can be very useful to know major karmic events that are going to happen for you. Like, for example, I could see that there was an extremely high likelihood, if not certainty, that I would break my back in a car wreck, which I did when I was 19. I can see it in my chart. I can see the birth of my son. I can see my marriages, right? Because there's certain things that show it. I could even see my divorce, you know, from a couple of those women, because they didn't match certain things. And so you can learn about how the karmas are ripening throughout your life. And one of the big differences between Vedic astrology and Western astrology is the North Indians, which that's who I kind of vibe with, the North Indian form of Jyotish. There's an additional chart called the Navamsa, or it's sometimes the South Indians believe it's a marriage chart, but the North Indians say it's a second half of life chart, or sometimes it can be triggered by getting married. But that shows your karmas post 40. And so if you've just hit 40, or you're approaching 40, or you're a few years into 40, and you want to see what's coming for that second half of life, it's really awesome. For people in their mid to late 30s, I recommend get your natal chart and get your Navamsa. And the natal chart still carries over into your second half of life, but increasingly, the more you move in the second half of your life, the further you get from it. Like the North Indians call the natal chart the tree, and the Navamsa the fruit of the tree. And they say, sure, sometimes you have a beautiful tree and a beautiful fruit, but sometimes, like me, I have a garbage natal chart, other than you know, intelligence and a couple other things. It's quite bad. And that was my experience for the first 40 years. It was it was an S show, I'll say that. It was a cluster F, right? It was awful. But my Navamsa is very powerful. And some people have that night and day dichotomy. And even if you don't have a huge difference in terms of like your material success or whatever, the focus of your life is going to change a lot post 40 for basically almost everyone. The charts are almost always quite distinct from each other, and sometimes dramatically, like in my case. And so if you want to know if you're going to be rich or famous or wealthy, or if you're going to do well in your career, or if you're going to have children or get married, or when's likely time to meet a partner, I mean, those are the kinds of questions I answer, you know, doing charts. I also teach angelic magic, if that interests you. Right now, I'm just teaching angelic and archangelic magic, but I have worked my way up through the choirs and spheres, and I've worked all the way up: angels, archangels, principalities, virtues, powers, dominions, cherubim, not cherubim, ophanum, cherubim, and seraphim. And I've worked my way up through those spheres and choirs, and so I will be teaching that at some point. But I require my students to first do angelic and archangelic magic. So I teach that. I also do spiritual guidance and counseling as part of that. And so if you're interested in any of those services, I would love to help you as best I can. And you can find those on my whitelotusoflight.com.
All right, perfect.
Well, thank you so much for having me on again, Tobias. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Yeah.
Bye.
Awesome. All right, bye.